In terms of an exhibition, there's been so many different thematics behind exhibitions, and I think that's what makes them so interesting, is someone's idea is brought to light through visual communication. And it could be a political issue, it could be a social issue, it could just highlight an aesthetic, it could highlight a focus on absence of color. There's just so many different directions it could take.
The role of the curator is really interesting because they actually set the tone. They set the mood. You can actually see the history of their thought process as they select the work. It's a personal thing, like a bookshelf. Who took what books and how they put it on their shelf.
Curating, it means you know the history of art, you know the history of the type of painting you're curating, and then you select the work in order to present a visual variation of that particular theme. I was a board member of the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and we wanted to have an exhibition with our sister province in China. As an art historian, I said, well, it would be great to show art, but to show art landscape, because landscape painting is very important. The purpose of Spaces and Places was to introduce Alberta to Hong Kong and to northern China, and to do it visually rather than just text. Not only do we have a varied landscape, but we have a long history of landscape artists, starting with Lars Håkanes, and then we had Marian Nicol, of course. From there it spread because the landscape is visually so inviting and artists automatically respond to it. Everybody responds differently to the landscape of Alberta. So we have the flatlands, we have the majestic skies, we have trees and forests and water and everything. It was very fascinating. Not only were we in Hong Kong, and I gave a lecture there, but I also gave a lecture in Harbin. There were at least 200, if not 300 people in the audience. I was explaining to them what the various paintings were doing, because it was totally new for most of the young people that they could see and hear what it was about. And so it was educative for them. And I think it introduced Alberta to them.
The Indigenous works were curated into the Narrative Quest exhibition, which I had curated for display in 2009. It was very significant in that it was the first exhibition of solely Indigenous art that had been curated from the AFA collection. We contracted Joan Cardinal Schubert, visual artist, mentor, curator, activist, and she was researching our holdings and then endeavoring to increase our holdings of Indigenous artists and look at Indigenous artists that were not represented in the collection.
So when she curated my work for the first time, I didn't quite understand how I fit into the First Nations. I was young, and I didn't know how I fit in the exhibition that she was creating. Joan was responsible for me understanding that I was a First Nations artist. I was amazed that when I came into the gallery, that on one side was Alex Janvier, a whole row of Alex Janvier, and opposite was my work. And at that point in time, I knew in 2 seconds. And so Joan's curating has changed the way Alberta artists understand being First Nations. She was a big part of me understanding who I was.
We had a panel. Adrian Stimson was monitoring. We had Tanya Harnett, Faye Heavy-Shield, Aaron Paquette, David Garneau on the panel. So representation from young, emerging, to more established.
Remembering back to Narrative Quest, it was a great opportunity to show my work at that time, but also do a performance in response to Joan Cardinal's work, The Lesson, which is a schoolroom with chalkboards with various messages written on it. I came out in a full suit and then started writing on the chalkboard, but then it became messy in the sense that all the chalk and such started to come onto the suit. And so it was this really interesting overlay of the board itself and the remnants of the board and how that attached to me as an artist, but also just speaking to that history in general and the impact that the lesson had on me in particular was one that I felt important to share.
The morning before that, we were installing Joan's work and then got word that she had passed away. And it was such a emotional moment, and you feel that loss of her. So I chose to dedicate the exhibition to the memory of Joan.
I find it really emotional. It's really emotional to think that this was her last project. There's an important bit from Joan's writing. It's a poem that she had on a poster. And her words were, "Let the next generation be born with the knowledge of what passed."
My name is Autumn Whiteway, and my spiritual name is Night Singing Woman. I am the 21-22 Emerging Curator Fellow for Alberta Foundation for the Arts. I spent several weeks going through all of the collections of the Alberta Foundation for the Arts online and coming up with different pairings of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists. The exhibition that I came up with is called Cross Cultura. It's a comparison of Indigenous and non-Indigenous aesthetics. I took artworks that were compositionally similar or had similar topics to compare them together to come up with some of the differences between cultures and some of the similarities. And the non-Indigenous artwork is primarily from a Eurocentric, settler, colonial viewpoint. For example, in one of the pairings, I take a look at dancing, and Indigenous people were banned through the Indian Act from practicing their dances. Dancing was becoming very popular, particularly amongst women in the 1930s and 40s as their rights within society increased, and dance halls became a very popular place for social activities and finding romance. One of the great things that came out of the pandemic is the ability to put these exhibitions online. So it's not just a localized audience that can come to see it, it's an international audience that can consume these exhibitions. I've had a company building a 3D virtual gallery for me. Hopefully it'll be ready soon. I didn't want those white plain gallery walls. As an Indigenous person, I wanted it to be back to nature. And so what they're creating is a forest gallery for me, and the viewer can wander through the forest and they'll come across my artworks hanging on hide stretchers or hanging from leather frames from the trees. And then inside this forest space, I've also inserted little Easter eggs everywhere where they can get knowledge on different Indigenous issues as well. The impact of being the 2021 to 22 Emerging Curator Fellowship has been really to cement myself in the world of curation by gaining recognition for the beautiful exhibitions that I'm able to put together. I'm not just an artist, I'm not an archaeologist, but I also do curation. The curator's power is to present it to the audience in meaningful and impactful ways. So they can influence somewhat the interpretation of how the audience views the artworks.